Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. This is your ever faithful host, Josh Bertram, and we have our political host, Will. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Yeah, thanks.
How's your attempt to try to rule the Proud Boys? They're getting their inner circle. Is that working all right?
Yeah, well, we have a vote. We have a community vote this weekend. So, with any luck, I'll get nominated. So, we'll see. I'll keep you updated.
That's awesome. Well, today we have on our program Professor Richard Moule Jr. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of South Florida. He earned his BS in Criminology and Justice Studies from the College of New Jersey and his MS, Master's of Science, and PhD in Criminology and Criminal Justice from Arizona State University. His primary research interests include criminology theory, the influence of technology on social life, and the perceptual and microsocial dimensions of crime and crime control. Dr. Moule has conducted research on, among other topics, offenders' use of the internet, the influence of technology on perceptions of police, and the public perceptions of police militarization. Man, Rick, thanks so much for being on the podcast with us today. I know I can speak for both of us when I say we're really excited to have a conversation about this really, really important topic. So thanks for being on.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you, fellas.
Well, absolutely. So, Rick, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying law enforcement.
So I started grad school in 2009. I graduated college right when the recession hit. And not really knowing what to do, I said, okay, I'm going to try and go to graduate school. And I was doing my master's at ASU, and I get approached by a faculty member who I didn't know at the time was a pretty big deal. My mentor, Scott Decker. And Scott approached me one day, and first thing he asked me, he goes, have you ever been in jail? I go, no. He goes, okay, well, we're doing interviews in the Fresno County Jail with offenders in a couple weeks. Would you be interested? We'll pay to fly you out. We'll put you in a hotel. And, for any prospective graduate students listening, when people ask you if you want to do things right, say yes, because you never know where it'll lead.
Yes.
And for a year, in a host of cities, we interviewed current, former, and non-gang members about how they use the internet.
Wow.
And so that's my background, right? That's got nothing to do with studying law enforcement. But partway through graduate school, Ferguson happens. And I remember seeing the news and just being blown away. And I don't know how old you guys are. I'm in my mid-30s. I have vague recollections of the WTO protests in the late 90s. And I kind of remember the G20 in Pittsburgh. That's when I was graduating college. But seeing Ferguson and the protests, and then Freddie Gray in Baltimore, these images of police holding surplus military weapons, decked out in full tactical and body gear, I really didn't know what to do with that. That was so antithetical to kind of what I thought about, how we were doing as a society, kind of the place we were in. And in response to that, President Obama convenes the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. It's a whole host of policing experts, of community stakeholders from around the U.S. They get testimony from, it's got to be over 100, topical experts, clergy, policy, the whole shebang. And one of the things they talked about in that report is militarization. And they had testimony that said, militarization really undermines public trust and confidence in police. We didn't have any, I'm going to say, empirical evidence. Not that this testimony isn't important, but we didn't have any real evidence about how the public felt about this topic. And that really motivated me to move into studying how people feel about the police. And much of my work in probably the 5-6 years subsequent to that has been understanding how people feel about police militarization and related issues and why they feel that way.
Wow. Yeah. So kind of in that same vein with police militarization, depending on when a person is watching or listening to this podcast, it would have been on the heels of a shooting in Buffalo, and it would have been after a shooting in Texas at an elementary school. Reportedly, in both situations, the assailant, had some level of rifle that is typically kind of attributed to military or what have you, and in one of the two for sure, there the individual had like body armor. So like how important is it for police to be militarized when the folks that they are trying to defend them from or protect them from also have military style equipment?
So there's a couple parts to that, Will. Mm-hmm. The first part is that phenomena of a heavily armored and armed offender or group of offenders is not new. And actually, you have these handful of sentinel events involving those circumstances that have really shaped, kind of police practices over the past 30 years. For example, the most prominent is probably the North Hollywood shootout, where a guy goes in to rob a bank. He's got a high-powered rifle. He's in head-to-toe body armor. The police only have handguns, and they end up having to go to a local gun shop and get rifles to be able to eventually take this guy down.
Wow.
So recognizing there are circumstances where the police are going to encounter these kinds of things, and they do necessarily need those tools, right? I think that's important. Where the issue of militarization comes in, gets at what are those circumstances? And that's a hotly debated topic. So we'll start there. That there are laws, policies, procedures, restrictions on the acquisition of surplus military weapons and some forms of equipment. And actually, I saw yesterday, so we're doing this on May 25th, if I reference dates. It was announced President Biden is supposed to enact another executive order that will reinstate limitations on the transfer of surplus military equipment to local law enforcement through the federal 1033 program, the military lend-lease program. The other kind of part of it is that when we talk about militarization in some way, shape, or form has been going on since the 1960s. It really starts to accelerate in the 1980s and accelerates further following the events of September 11th, where police are working to deal with the worst circumstances that they might encounter, right? They never want to be put in a position like the North Hollywood shootout again, where they can't really do anything about bad people doing bad things. But those circumstances, all things considered, are few and far between. And so part of what I am interested in is kind of what shapes people feeling that the police having these items or engaging in these behaviors is appropriate, and what are the circumstances under which they see it as appropriate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, we need to have an ability to defend ourselves, but at the same time, these because this has become more standardized. This is what I'm kind of hearing you say. The militarization, military equipment has become more standardized, that the normal police has maybe far more military or far more deadly equipment than they maybe had in the past. Would you say that's correct?
I would say that's accurate. And it's important too. So the 1033 program gets a lot of legs in the early to mid 90s. And if you do a Google search and you look at kind of what the coverage of that program is like in the 90s, what you'll see is the discourse surrounding it is very different than it is today.
Where, real quick, Rick, can you explain what the 1033 program is?
Sure. So, part of what folks should understand is up through the 1960s, the federal government had very little involvement in local policing. So local policing today relies in part on federal funding. There are lots of federal funding initiatives that provide money, equipment, grants, so on and so forth to local law enforcement. In the 1980s, there's the first kind of equipment transfer program, 1208, that would give federal agencies surplus military equipment. And in the 90s, the 1033 program extends that equipment transfer to local law enforcement. Under this program, local law enforcement can apply to get a variety of surplus military, I'm going to say gear as this kind of all-encompassing term. They can get firearms, and firearms is most of what is controversial. They can get vehicles, and by vehicles, I don't just mean, say, an armored personnel carrier or a Bearcat or anything like that. I mean, I'm talking SUVs, pickup trucks, any type of surplus equipment that the military might have. They can also get computing equipment, right? They can get office equipment, right? You need chairs, cabinets, computers, all that kind of stuff. They get that too. That is the gist of the 1033 program. It's basically what you can go to the federal government and say, I would like this equipment, and you, as an agency, can potentially get it.
Right. And so then the difference between then and the 90s and now, what you're going to say something about that. What is that?
Yeah. So in the late 90s, when you saw coverage of these programs, there wasn't a lot of talk about military weapons. It tended to be, and the couple examples that always stick out to me, I'm from southern New Jersey, is the Camden Police Department, when the city had its own police force, got helicopters. You had
Camden's rough, huh? Camden?
Yeah. Yes. I hear it's doing better. I know they have a different style police force now. But then you had cases in Nebraska where they're getting armored personnel carriers, and they're not getting it for their SWAT teams necessarily. It's because they need to deal with the possibility of floods, and they need vehicles that can get through rising water. And, it's really not until Ferguson in 2014 when there's a lot more discourse surrounding how broad this program is and the kinds of equipment that are being transferred to local departments.
Interesting. Now, this is going to be sort of like a real basic question, but I'm curious. Why do we even have police in the first place? And maybe you can walk us through sort of the history, good, bad, and indifferent, of policing, law enforcement, and kind of where we are today.
Sure. So the first thing I'm going to say is that what the role of the police is depends upon whom you ask. There are kind of these conflicting views about what the police are. Some people say the police are the apolitical enforcers of the law, right? That's all they do. They enforce law. Some people say they are the solver of human problems, right? Because a lot of the people and circumstances that police encounter won't necessarily be criminal, right? The role of the police over time has also changed for a variety of reasons. But if you go back, for example, to the founding of this country, we don't have police the way we have police today. Police as a formalized entity really don't exist until roughly the mid 19th century. They come out of large cities. I believe the first formal police departments from upstate New York.
Wow.
Before that, you have sheriffs. You have, and sheriffs aren't just police at that point. They're the tax collectors, right? They're kind of this Swiss Army knife government official. If you watch the old Westerns, right, it's the sheriff is usually one guy. He might have one deputy, and then when things get really bad, he's going to deputize a posse.
Yep.
Right.
From the mid 19th century into the early part of the 20th century, you have the slow formalization of police, but the police at that point are also incredibly political. Right? There are a lot of political appointees. There's a lot of corruption. And the police are able to do a lot of bad things. One of the examples I like to give my students is if y'all are familiar with the phrase the third degree.
Mm-hmm.
So the third degree historically is the police would coerce suspect confessions through force.
Really?
Yes. And that gets highlighted by the Wickersham Commission in the 1930s as being something that, hey, the police probably shouldn't do this. The police, kind of between the 30s and the 50s, get a lot more professionalized. That's where you have the first movement. You want folks with a high school degree, in some cases, a college degree. You want them to have, training, uniforms. It's the first time they get, substantive technology, right? They have cars. You have call boxes. You have the advent of the police radio. But you still have, very simple police, right? They carry a revolver and probably a nightstick and not a whole lot else. Where this starts to change is the 1960s, where you start having more prominent instances of civil unrest. All right, we talk about the long, hot summer of the late 1960s, race riots in a number of American cities. In response to this, as well as part of the civil rights movement, you have agencies start forming what are effectively the earliest version of SWAT teams, what we call paramilitary style units. And they're meant to deal with riots and hostage situations. And that's really it. If you ever watch the original Dawn of the Dead from the 80s, right? So they're in Philadelphia in the beginning, and you see the cops, and they've got the very 80s style body armor, and they have,
right.
The Vietnam surplus weapons.
Right.
That's kind of the image that I guess you could take away from these early paramilitary units. And by the 90s, most large police departments have those kinds of units. And what ends up happening is the role of those units expands over time. So they're serving warrants, for example. And that's kind of the early history of militarization. Now, Will, to get back to your question, what's the role of the police? Ideally, it's to ensure public safety. Right? So the defining feature of the police, more than anything else, is that they are authorized to use coercive force to gain the compliance of people.
Domestic tranquility.
Yeah, that is what the police are for. That's not always what they do,
but it's what they're for.
But it's their defining features, their capacity to use coercive force. Which is
if you think about it, that's quite the what do you call it? The allowance that they have permission to use deadly force.
Yes.
And they're covered by, the law. They can legally kill people.
Yes.
That's like, if you think about that, what a responsibility and a burden that you have to legally be able to kill somebody in a situation and have that kind
Absolutely.
of power. What do you think of you've done so much study in this, and in the trends, you outline some of this stuff. What are the major issues that are facing policing today, right now in America? What would you say are the top three issues that they're facing?
Top three.
Or four, whatever. Just whatever comes to mind.
One is, so I think there are two broad areas. One is what's happening outside policing, and I would say two are what's happening in policing. Outside of policing is this persisting public discourse about the police, what their role is, how receptive they should be to public criticism, public oversight, things of that nature, right? And that's really been going on since Ferguson. Within agencies, you have two parallel issues that are coming to a head. The first one is growing recognition of mental health issues in policing, right? Being a police officer is stressful, right? You know, you're on shift work, right? So you might be working overnight.
Yes.
You're dealing with a lot of people that the encounter you are having with them, they are having the worst experience of their lives.
Yeah.
You know, you're dealing with some people that aren't stable, some people that are violent, some people that want to hurt you, right? You're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. That takes a toll.
The people
Right?
that most of us don't ever deal with, or rarely deal with, they're dealing with on a consistent basis.
Yes. The other part of this, and it's related, is people leaving policing. And I don't think this is just a policing issue. I think this is kind of a public occupations issue. But really, post-COVID, I shouldn't say post-COVID, a couple years into COVID.
Post-Floyd?
Yeah. You're seeing people leave policing, and they leave for a variety of reasons, right? Not just that it's stressful, but it doesn't necessarily pay well. You are subject to a lot of criticism. You know, it is a lot of work, so on and so forth. Those are good. Those kinds of issues are going to have really serious ramifications for public safety.
Yeah. So I guess should we defund the police? You know, there's a you know, a particular political viewpoint that defunding police would help society as a whole, and you know, I'm not necessarily bought into that at this stage, and I'm the liberal of the group. Josh is the conservative, so you know, I'm not necessarily bought into it, and I haven't really heard a good convincing argument for it. But I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts, and then if you know, if you do think we should defund the police, you know, I'd love to hear reasons why, and then the same if you don't believe that we should not defund the police.
Sure. So first, it's important to acknowledge that the phrase defunding the police, that it means different things to different people. So if I'm going to characterize a couple ways that I guess we could talk about it, and then I'll share my thoughts.
Okay.
So defunding the police for some people means completely getting rid of the police. Not necessarily in favor of that. I think if you look at America in the early, up to and including the early part of the 20th century, even when we have police, but those police are politically focused, potentially corrupt, bad things can happen. If you say that defunding means reallocating police resources to mental health provisions and things like that, I think that's a possibility. I think the important part is that regardless of what the characterization you have, we evaluate, you know, if you take, you know, okay, so we've got this pot of money and we take part of that pot of money and we move it somewhere else. But we need to know whether or not moving that money did good things, or if it did anything, or God forbid, if it did bad things, right? I think what you were seeing, the kind of discussions around defunding more deeply reflect incredible levels of dissatisfaction with the police and the behavior of police, at least in certain circumstances. And that's kind of the bigger issue. That's how I look at it.
So so we have the way that police act, and I've heard you talk about the shift that happened with Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the Ferguson effect? What happened there that changed public opinion, it seems, so deeply? What happened, and why do you think it waited till now to happen? Because obviously there's been a history of tension between the black community and and police departments and things like that. At least at a minimum, it's what I think the media has portrayed recently, and obviously I think there has been obviously real tension between the two groups. What do you think? What's going on with the Ferguson effect? What happened? Why did it happen now as opposed to in the 90s?
So, well, it's interesting you bring up the 90s. So, we can contrast kind of two major events, right? Let's talk about, well, we'll do three events. Let's go back to the 1960s. Okay, it's the civil rights era, and you have footage being shown on national nightly news of Bull Connor aiming fire hoses and unleashing dogs on civil rights protesters. Okay? And people that aren't living in the South,
yeah,
and people that aren't black are looking at this and going, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening.
Yeah.
Now let's contrast that within the 90s. You have George Holliday's video of the beating of Rodney King, right? That he gets kind of by a happy accident, right? He's bought a brand new camcorder. He's out on his patio, and suddenly, down the street, you see Rodney King getting beat by cops. And then we kind of don't talk about, these race-related issues are there. They've been there since before the 1960s. They started getting a lot more attention in the 1960s, but they've been there for quite some time. What changes with Ferguson is kind of these conflicting narratives, right? So the great irony of Ferguson is that we don't have video of the death of Michael Brown. But there are other instances and events around that time point, right? We have Eric Garner. And you see Eric Garner die on camera.
Right.
Right? You have Walter Scott, where he gets tased, and and then there's another one where the guy goes to get in his car and he gets shot by the police officer in the gas station parking lot. When we started seeing that, you're going, okay, this is happening in a lot of places. We're not hearing, we're not seeing whatever narrative that had been discussed from the perspective of law enforcement. We're not seeing that reflected on video in these cases. And, you're seeing, when people call for change, particularly in Ferguson, you're seeing this response that's inconsistent with what you would expect, right? Where you see these heavily armed officers, right? I still think of the picture of Ferguson at Christmas time, and it's season's greetings, and you've got, smoke grenades going off. And, now it's people have cell phones. They'll take cell phone footage. That was the big thing with Eric Garner, was the big thing with Walter Scott, where you're seeing people that are willing to record, and they're putting that out there. And I'm not saying those narratives are always right or that those videos tell the whole story, but that's something that, prior to the mid-2000s really couldn't happen.
Yeah.
And it always seems, and maybe this is just my own skewed viewpoint, but it always seems like videos show police disproportionately mistreating minorities or people of color, and it's one of those, like, I mean, I've heard the debates from both sides, actually, white people get beat up too, or what have you, but when you see sort of the abundance of video and it's mainly police attacking black people, you begin to start to believe that maybe that's just an issue. Like, is there any evidence to back that up, or to provide a counter narrative to what we're seeing?
So what ends up happening is that, in part, right, you're gonna, if you see a video that goes viral, is probably going to be pretty awful. It's going to depict something that we probably don't want to see. Right? Start there. It's a good way to put this. There are going to be over 1 million police citizen encounters a year. Okay? Mostly traffic stops. 1 to 2% of those are going to involve a use of force.
1 to 2% out of a million.
Use of force is very rare. To say nothing of lethal force, right? So when I say use of force, it's, so you have this kind of continuum where the first part is the police are just there, right? They've already showed up. And some people just go, oh, the police are here. I'm gonna do whatever they say. You get commands, right? Asking, step out of the car.
So is the command a use of force?
It is forceful under the law. It's coercive because you're supposed to follow a lawful order. But we're not going to. When we say use of force, we're not thinking about that.
Right.
We're thinking about
elevated.
Are they putting?
It's now elevated. Right. Okay.
Are they striking a person? Are they tasing a person? Are they shooting a person? Right. That's when we talk about use of force. That's really what we want to talk about. But those instances, even among those 1 to 2% are rare. Now part of that also has to do with we don't have good data on police use of force. Not some states have started implementing, laws to monitor. Texas, for example, when the police point a gun at someone. Most states, you document when you discharge a firearm.
That's interesting.
But we don't have a global sense of how often this occurs, and we have no database at say the federal level about this.
So when you're talking about okay, so I'm just trying to get this all straight in my mind. We have Ferguson, and what's happening at Ferguson is you have this recording or something caught right on video, but you said it wasn't even on video, but it was basically one thing that became viral. And there were several other instances that happened around the same time. There was a constellation of these events within a short period of time, and on video, right?
Yes.
That have been recorded somehow. And because of the proliferation of cell phones and video equipment, we're just going to see a lot more of this. I mean, just in general, right? Just basically law of numbers kind of thing, statistics kind of thing. Like you have that many people, that many interactions. If you got 1 million interactions and you start to increase the amount of ability for the people that are being citizens to have a recording device handy within seconds, then you're going to have more interactions with the police recorded.
Yes.
And then, of course, then you're going to see more issues. Not that they weren't there before, right? Obviously, it seems like they were, but they weren't known, or they weren't seen, or they're only known to certain people. So I've seen all these body cameras. You said that we don't have good data, which makes sense. What's going on with the body cameras? Why do we have body cameras? What have they even done to help? Because this is it's supposed to keep police accountable, right? And it's supposed to be a measure to bring public accountability to police, and so people can see it. What's going on with the body cameras? Have they gone? Has it been a success?
So I'll take a step back for a sec, because there's a second part of the Ferguson effect that's also important, and it relates to the cameras.
Nice.
That the expectation of police, arguments by, I believe it was the St. Louis police chief was the first one to use the phrase Ferguson effect. It gains a lot of attention in a Wall Street Journal op-ed by Heather McDonald, a conservative commentator. You have James Comey says there's a viral video effect. The kind of implicit assumption with the Ferguson effect is that police officers, out of fear of being recorded or from experiencing this public hostility, that they are withdrawing from their policing responsibilities. They're not being as proactive. They're less willing to use force, even if it might be necessary and or justified.
And that's the Ferguson effect.
Yes.
Basically, that because there's so many cameras around, the police are not going to be as effective because they won't use force because they're afraid.
Well, that they'll pull back because they're afraid of going viral, being the next
one on the news.
Yes. Now, this leads to body cameras. And I referenced before President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. One of the pushes from that report was the use of body cameras by law enforcement. And this came with substantial funding from the federal government to get body cameras to police agencies. And the use of body cameras, right, their implementation, their deployment, when they get turned on, policies surrounding them, what they do for evidence. They've been scrutinized pretty heavily for the past 7 years. But we see a lot of mixed evidence about what they do. And we can think of a couple reasons why that might be. So, for example, if you want to talk about use of force, right? We have mixed evidence about whether cameras reduce use of force. One of the assumptions early on was that cameras would have a civilizing effect on people, right? People know they're under scrutiny because they're being recorded. Well, a lot of people don't know that the police have body cameras. You know, think about someone who's, say, under the influence of drugs or alcohol. They probably don't know. But they're also probably more likely to do the kinds of things, to engage in resistance, to engage in aggression with police, that make the use of force more likely.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right? So we have this kind of complex problem now. Overall, I'd say it's pretty mixed. You know, with respect to accountability, one of the main issues, and we do have some circumstances, I think it was Aurora, Colorado, the two police officers that go to arrest the woman walking out of Walmart. She's got dementia.
Yeah. They
break her arm. And
holy smokes.
Oh yeah, that was rough to watch.
Jeez.
But so in some cases, I think in that case, it's one example. You have, you know, officers on film not behaving in a way that comports with departmental policy, or in other cases with departmental policy or law, and they are punished in some way. I think that's good, right? I think everybody in policing, right, whether you are a police officer or whether you study the police, and whether you're just a regular citizen, you want better policing, right?
Yeah.
The other part of that is if you talk to police officers and you ask them, are there bad officers in your department? Yes.
Yeah.
And by bad officers, it's officers that do bad things.
Right.
That undermine police community relations, that, you know, just you wouldn't want them to be police officers. The difficult part with respect to accountability is that body cameras are only one part of it. So, for example, if I'm an agency and I have body camera footage of an arrest, and the officer, you know, tells a suspect, shut the fuck up, get on the ground, you know, just whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They might not break any policies, right? Might not break any laws, but we might not like the way that looks.
Right.
Right? A lot of uses of force are what we call lawful but awful. That the police have the authority to use this and they're using it. It doesn't look good. but they can do it, given the particular set of circumstances they are encountering. In other circumstances, we might have footage of them doing something they shouldn't do. And it might be illegal, it might not, right? It can be against policy and be perfectly legal, right? And say they get suspended without pay for a day or two.
Right.
Is that accountability? Certainly they've been held accountable in some way.
Right.
But the public might not find that satisfying.
Yeah.
You know, to say nothing of bad police who do egregiously bad things and say don't get fired.
Yeah.
Or they do get fired, but then they can move one town over and be a police officer again. Right? That's quite possible.
Yeah, it always seems like it's always weird whenever I see sentencing for law enforcement, because I mean, so I'm former military. I was in the infantry, and I remember, you know, certain ways that I would behave under pressure, despite being trained to the contrary, kind of in the heat of the moment. And you know, so whenever there's a police officer that, you know, behaves in a way that's untowards, you know, the population he's sworn to protect, you know, I obviously feel sympathy for the victims in that situation, but there's a small part of me that also is like, gosh, you know, like, how would I have handled that? You know, I mean, if assuming that you remove any sort of, you know, racism, whatever, or any of the other accusations that are you know, that may be part of the conversation, but how do you train, you know, a police officer to make the right decision, to grab their taser, not their gun, you know, like in very high pressure situations? Like, how do you even do that?
So part of the taser example is a really good one, actually. Was it Minneapolis?
I think so.
So this is the thing, right? Now we have so many of these instances that when we talk about them, we have to make sure we've got the correct
the right one. Yeah.
It's like school shootings. Yeah, which one, you know?
So, you know, with the taser or the gun, for example, well, there are a couple things, right? So as an officer, you're going to be trained to use both, right? Start there.
Right.
The second part will typically be they're on opposite sides of your hip, right? So if you're, you know, right-handed, you know, say your gun's going to be on your right side. Well, then your taser's going to be on your left side. Or in other cases, your taser's actually on your chest, right? The taser's meant to feel different. It's meant to be lighter, right? It's different colors, right? So we build these kind of steps in to hopefully alleviate some of that. Excuse me. Thinking about, you know, training, the one of the big paradoxes of policing is the police get a whole lot of training relative to a lot of other professions.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they have enough training. You know, there's variability across jurisdictions and states in the amount of training and what they get trained in and how much training they'll get. One of the best examples of this kind of in the past post-Ferguson, well, in the post-Ferguson era, is the emphasis on de-escalation training. Where, okay, how do you know, you come into a situation and the suspect that you're dealing with is at an 8. Well, if you just come at him, bad stuff's probably pretty likely to happen because he's already fired up, right? How do you calm him down? Right?
Yeah.
And
that's a lot of pressure.
How do you deal, you know, one of the things in the 90s, there was field work, the Project in Policing Neighborhoods Project in Indianapolis and St. Petersburg, Florida. And so you have researchers doing ride-alongs with police. And they're documenting all the interactions that the police are having with citizens. And what they find, and this has been replicated subsequently, is that the police, you know, the police have opportunities where they can use force, coercive force, and they don't. Right? They're really holding back. And that's, I think, a good thing.
Yes.
the the difficult part is when the police are confronted with circumstances where things are very up in the air.
Right.
Right. And talk to police. The first thing they'll tell you is the most important thing in my job is that I go home at the end of my shift.
Yeah. Every one of them says that.
And that makes things difficult because, right. And Will, you alluded to being a veteran, right? I suspect if it's you or the other guy, you want to win, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, definitely.
That can promote circumstances in which force gets used, probably justified, not always. But if there are alternative ways in which we can solve those kinds of interactions, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah,
and we're only starting to understand that.
Because when you talk about training, it's like, I mean, like not all training is created equal, right? So
yeah.
And I would imagine if you are a law enforcement officer and you've got a sidearm that could kill somebody, and that's just part of your normal uniform every day, that you would have a ton of just range time to practice with that. I mean, like we had a friend of mine who's a ex-Green Beret, and he owns his own company. I'm gonna plug it. It's Quiet Pro Tactical, and he trains law enforcement folks. Real good guy, And I haven't personally taken his training, but I know him at a personal level, and I can only assume he does a really, really good job. But I'd imagine there aren't a lot of companies out there that are providing as really, really good training as he's providing. So so is training really the only solution, or is there another kind of solution to improve policing in neighborhoods?
So it's a couple parts, right? So the theme of my talking to you all, right? Everything's complicated. Some of it's law. Laws are the basis for a lot of police policy, right? If you want to increase police accountability, you need laws to do so.
Right.
Whether, most prominently, I think at the state level, but also at the local level, to the extent that's possible. You need policies, right, that are clear, right, that officers have guidance on. You need adequate training, including continuing training. You also need, and this is where law gets more complicated, but police work closely with prosecutors and district attorneys. What we've seen over the past almost decade is a lot of prosecutors don't want to be involved in cases involving police departments that they work with. Right? We saw this in Minneapolis, where I believe it was the Attorney General was doing the investigation into a lot of the circumstances surrounding the death of George Floyd. And that was who, was going to bring charges. It was the state, not that local district attorney. Because you have those working relationships. So that's hard.
Yeah. How are you going to charge the guy you've had coffee with or whatever, donuts? You know what I mean? And just seeing.
Yeah, and it's not even. I don't want your listeners to misconstrue that, right? It's not that it doesn't happen,
sure,
or that it won't happen, but that is.
It's an understandable human thing, though, right?
Yeah. And because you as a prosecutor's office, you're going to rely on police to bring you cases.
Yeah.
Right. You're going to rely on them
relationship.
Yeah, that's challenging. I think those are all parts of it. You need, even things like one of the things I've been doing a little bit of reading on is collective bargaining, and how collective bargaining for a lot of police unions limits the ability of third-party oversight. So civilian oversight, for example. Those are constrained both in some respects by law and these collective bargaining agreements. So that presents its own challenge.
Oh, yeah. I mean, honestly, there's so many questions that are rolling in my mind now. And this always happens, by the way. It's always like when there's 10 minutes left or whatever, we try to keep it around an hour or whatever, but it's always when we have just a little bit of time left. And then all these questions are in my mind. So, so I just want to give some thoughts real quick, because as I'm hearing you talk, what's impressing me the most is the messiness and the complexity when the public gets involved in really specialized things that affect them. I'm not saying the public shouldn't be involved, right, in this, and there shouldn't be public opinion. But again, half the stuff you've told me today, I didn't know. Maybe I could have, figured it out or whatever it is. But it's like you have these relationships that people have. Like for instance, I could see a news article that said, local prosecutor won't take up case. And it's like painting this person this terrible picture when the reality is it's a conflict of interest, or three of their buddies, or one of them was caught up in it and they can't, or whatever it is, you know what I'm saying? But it's like you see something and you just don't know what's really going on. And you form these opinions based on such little information, like a video. And again, I don't know anybody that I would ask that would say, do you think it's okay for police to systematically abuse, kill, and oppress the Black community? I don't think anybody would say yes. I'm sure there are people that would, but not people that I know. You know what I mean? I know that there are people that would say that, but I don't think my guess is it's not the norm. Most people are like, no, of course we don't want that. We want things to be better. But one of the things that starts happening, and one of the debates I see, is that the police forces are systemically racist. And I could see why people think that. And I think I don't know if I should say obviously, but my assumption is that there's really good reason for them to think that based on history, right? We look at the history, like you said, of the civil rights movements and things like that, where these, police forces in the South were brutal at times, right? Or brutal, maybe all the time to the Black community. So what, and answer this however you feel comfortable, but to what degree do you feel like in your studies you've seen systematic racism in law enforcement?
So
I know that's a heavy question, but it's a question probably everyone is most interested in terms of is there, because of everything we've seen on media and just the culture we have right now.
So,
yeah.
Man, that's a heavy question. I think some listeners will immediately say yes, absolutely. Other folks might say no. I don't. Whew. Man, that is a good one.
Remember, we can edit anything out. You don't. You don't want to be in there.
No, I think the biggest thing with it when someone says that the police are systematically racist, if they mean that they are purposefully harming particular communities, I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I don't necessarily think that's the case. What we do see is different kinds of policing in different places. Those places have different kinds of people in them. Those places also...
Give me an example. What do you mean?
Okay. So, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Going back to the 1980s and earlier, but really in the 1980s, we see this. You have citizens in Philadelphia, inner city Philadelphia, so Black folks. that they talk about, and you've had other people subsequently use this phrase, that these communities are simultaneously over-policed and under-policed. They're over-policed to the extent that, they'll say, I see the cops. I get harassed by the cops. I get pulled over. My son gets, put on the sidewalk. He gets stopped and frisked. That kind of thing. That's a reality that we live with. But we're also under-policed because when I call the police, they don't show up. Or if they do show up, it's way too late. We're talking 4 to 6 or more hours later.
Wow.
And so if you want to understand kind of how this progresses, think about, major cities starting in the 1970s. We talk about, loss of jobs, out-migration of the middle class. So you have these pockets of cities that are impoverished. They don't have a lot of jobs. They don't have really good schools. People don't feel really good about the state of things. Okay? Under those circumstances, crime goes up. Right? Places where that disproportionately happened were communities of color. So then they're going to experience this kind of simultaneous over-policing and under-policing. Right? In Ferguson, for example, what you saw was, something like a third of the entire town had fines and fees from being ticketed. Because that's how the police department and the town made part of their budget. Right? You wouldn't like that, right? Where you guys live, you wouldn't want people getting pulled over just because we gotta fund the library. That's perverse, right? So you have that, and then you have just your interactions with police. And I suspect if I get pulled over, or Josh, if you get pulled over, you might have a different interaction than if Will got pulled over.
Yeah, I've heard that many, many times.
Yeah, by me, normally. That's normally me telling Josh that.
Okay. And that might depend on where you're at. Right? And it might depend on where you're at and whether, if I go into a neighborhood that's predominantly black, okay, I stick out. And maybe I get pulled over because of that. I don't know. So that's, I think the issue when we talk about, are these systemic? Well, if you have different people in different places experiencing different kinds of policing, including policing that we wouldn't characterize as good, whatever that might be, then it's a problem.
Right. And it's a problem that needs to be solved.
Yeah, it's not a good problem.
That begs to be solved, go ahead.
No, I mean, one of the things to keep in mind, and this is important too, there are something like 18,000 police departments in the U.S.
That's a lot of police departments.
That's a lot of police departments. So that's 18,000 different policies. Most departments have less than 10 officers.
Wow.
They're working with radically different kinds of communities, from rural somewhere that might have a couple hundred people to Philadelphia, LA, and New York City.
Yeah.
And so if you want to effectuate change, right, some of it might happen at the local level, but it's going to rely heavily on state level government, because that's who oversees the vast majority of law enforcement in this country.
So really the change has to happen on a state and local level. Like we put a lot on the federal government. You guys got to do something. President Biden, you got to make this work. You got to stop all this. But really, it's so much more complicated than that, right?
So as one example, to demonstrate how difficult this can be. So the federal government has very, 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 very little oversight of local law enforcement. Period. End of story. Right? That's because of the nature of our system of government.
Right.
starting in the 1930s, we had a data collection system called UCR, the Uniform Crime Report. And it's bean counting, right? How many murders does a town have? How many aggravated assaults does it have? So on and so forth. In 2021, we transitioned away from the UCR to this other system called NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. The federal government cannot compel a local law enforcement agency to participate in that system. So even under UCR, which had coverage of like 90% of police departments in this country, you had departments that just didn't report anything to the federal government because the government can't make them report it. NIBRS has radically less coverage in terms of police departments.
Really?
Yes, because NIBRS is much more expensive. It's a lot more data intensive. It's a lot more computing intensive. You need more personnel for it.
Yeah.
Well, like I just told you, most police departments have less than 10 full-time sworn officers. Mm-hmm. So you got to hire more people to run this data. And so, you're going to see this when, new crime statistics come out. We have less of a sense of how much crime there is in this country than ever before.
Really?
Yes. And part of that, so just that's to illustrate kind of what role can the federal government have? It can't compel agencies to do very much in the absence of a consent decree. If you look at what the executive order that was proposed yesterday by President Biden, most of what the federal government can do is can tie new requirements for police agencies to grants. Where if you all don't implement these policies, you're not eligible to receive federal grant money. That's about it.
It's always where the money is. That's I hear you. And this has been such a fascinating conversation. I have one more question.
Sure.
So what do you see as the trends that are shaping law enforcement, the trends happening right now that are shaping, that you believe, the trends emerging that you believe are shaping and will shape the future of law enforcement in America?
I think the biggest one is, again, going to be how do you recruit and maintain a sufficient number of officers? I think it's...
Because there's an exodus out of law enforcement.
Yes, I think the closest analogy is teachers, right? You have these serving professions that, these folks will say, I have a passion for helping people. I have a passion for teaching. I want to give back to my community. Those people are going to burn out because we asked them to do a whole lot, and we asked them to do a whole lot with not a lot of money.
Yeah. That's a great recipe for burnout.
Yes. And, I think that's part of it. I think the second part is going to be this continuing discourse about what the public wants from the police, what kind of policing they want, and how receptive to those requests, demands, and wants that police executives will be.
Yeah.
And the third part will be, there's been a push over the past 2 decades toward more evidence-based policing. So I tell my students, if you see a news report about a program and somebody that's in charge of an agency or that program says this program works, your first question should be, what evidence do you have that it works? How rigorous is that evidence? And there's been a strong push for many aspects of policing to be more evidence-based, more scientifically based, more, experimental evaluations and things like that. I think that's a good thing, but we'll see how far that will go under this, this broader circumstances of this discourse about policing and whether you can actually implement a lot of these programs or policies in the wake of people potentially leaving the profession.
Yeah, so we got these trends of this exodus from police, how people are going to, how the public is going to, ask or desire to be policed, and the willingness of the executives to actually comply with that. And then what was the third one?
The continued use of evidence-based policing.
Oh, evidence-based policing, yeah, I think that's amazing, man. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being on here, Rick. Man, it's been so cool. Where can people find your work or follow you, or are you on Twitter? What do you do? How can they find you?
You can see me at the USF website, the Department of Criminology. You can reach out to me through that. My work, if people are interested and they want to request it, they can email me. Some of it's publicly available. If y'all would like, I can send examples of articles your way if you want to post them on your website.
Yeah,
or
sure.
like that.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, those are the big things.
Great.
So,
well, thanks so much, Rick. It means a lot. Will, any final words?
No, I really appreciate it, Rick. Yeah. Thank you for your insight.
Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Well, guys, this has been Rick Moule and another episode of Faithful Politics. Can't wait to see you guys again. Until then, don't look left or right, but up. We should start using that, Will. All right.
All right.